The United States also had a tradition of, compared to Europe, fairly high wages on part of labor, which created an inclination towards mechanization. And then thrown in on top of that mixture towards the turn of the century was the fear on the part of industrial chemists, that is, chemists who were working in industry, supervising the operation of chemical plants, their design and construction, the fear on their part that they were losing ground in that area to mechanical engineers and in some cases civil engineers, and the feeling that they needed to separate themselves from chemists as a whole in order to reinforce their position as the one you turn to run a chemical plant or to design a chemical plant. And part of that was because the bulk of chemists in America were analytical chemists. They ran routine quality control checks, and by the turn of the century, those had become standardized. And a typical analytical chemist working in industry was running the same sample, 30 samples a day of percentage of silicon in iron or percentage of phosphorus in iron. And as the tests became standardized, they became sort of low-paid drudges, and you could train a shop boy to do the same thing if you took a little time. Analytical chemists were making roughly the equivalent today about $18,500. They were low-paid, and most people who were working in industry, when you said chemist, thought of this low-paid drudge working in the laboratory doing nothing original, instead of thinking of the production chemists, who were much smaller in numbers, who were designing and running. So the industrial chemists, or what I call the production chemists, wanted to separate themselves from those. And the way they began to do it was to emphasize their management role and their engineering role rather than their role as chemists. And that combination of longstanding American industrial traditions and this social factor of the social decline of the analytical chemists were sort of the ingredients that had begun to come together to create the idea of the chemical engineer. Production chemists began to feel threatened and began to look at a way to distinguish themselves by beginning to call themselves engineers instead of chemists. I forget who it was and exactly when it was, but a chemical manufacturer somewhere around 1905 to 1910 said he would rather hire an engineer with a smattering of chemistry than a chemist with a smattering of engineering. And that general attitude, which reflected the fact that the American chemical industry is focused on scale, dealing with some simple chemical reactions, but on a huge scale that required large machinery, as this engineering bias, rather than a chemical bias that you would have if the reaction were complicated and the machinery were secondary. You have that occurring at the same time. Chemists in industry are losing a lot of the importance that they early had if they're doing just routine work. That determines that, okay, it's in this period immediately after 1900 and 1910, that production chemists began to say our area's turf is being invaded by mechanical engineers because the owners of chemical manufacturing plants don't recognize the importance that chemistry can have in chemical manufacturing if the chemist knows engineering as well. And they're just thinking of chemistry as these drudges working in the laboratory, so they're giving design jobs, supervision jobs that we should have to the mechanical engineers. It's this happening between 1900 and 1910 that lead chemical engineers, that lead production chemists to want to emphasize the fact we're engineers, more than chemists.